Folktales. 6 programmes presented by Tony Arthur. Programme 2, Fairies.
When you think of a fairy, is it the tiny, gossamer-winged, prettified fairy like Tinker Bell in Peter Pan? Or is it the more earthy and unpredictable fairy of folk tales? All over the British Isles, these creatures have been given many evocative names. Hobs, hobgoblins, pixies, brownies, Pharisees, puka, and the little people. These inhabitants of the dark woods, wild heaths, and sinister pools have been around since the beginning of time, and are not to be trifled with. They're the original Time Lords, and centuries before Doctor Who came on the scene, fairies were the masters of time, space, and matter, using their supernatural powers to deceive and confound us poor mortals. To guard against these powers, people have protected themselves with numerous charms, counterspells, and rhymes.
Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go hunting for fear of little men. We folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather.
Michael O'Connor, a friend that I stayed with in Ireland, and his favourite fairy rhyme. It's part of a poem that tells of the trooping fairies, who travel around the countryside in large, noisy processions, hunting. Other sorts of fairies, such as hobgoblins and boggarts, are solitary fairies that haunt a particular person or locality, and they can be helpful or very mischievous, depending on their whim. They might curdle milk or turn over corn stooks, but treat them with care, and they can frequently be very useful to the housewife or farmer. Both the trooping fairies and the solitary fairy appear hundreds of times in folk tales. We think we know what they're supposed to do, and we know what they look like, although over the years their appearance seems to have changed somewhat. Did you know that, although it's said fairies have always been able to fly, they've only had wings since the 18th century? But what actually are fairies? Stuart Sanderson from Leeds University has some really interesting ideas of their origins.
One theory is that they are the people who lived in this country before our own particular race came and settled here. Let us say, if we go back to Celtic times, these are the proto-Celtic or pre-Celtic inhabitants who were forced out parts of the country by the new waves of Celtic settlers, and that what we are left with is a kind of dim folk memory of these people retiring into caves and underground dwellings. Another theory is that they are the discarded gods and heroes of pre-Christian religions. Another theory is that they are the people who lived here before Christianity came and who continued in remote parts of the country with pre-Christian rituals of various kinds, again secretly in remote corners. A final explanation is that they are really the souls of the ancestors, and this I think is probably the most reasonable explanation of fairy belief. The idea that the spirits of the departed are somehow close to us and that we have a rather special relationship with them. And I think this accounts for the stories not of individual fairies who haunt individual people or places they've been called, the fairy host of people who can be seen from time to time by those who are gifted with the second sight.
Stuart Sanderson, and here's yet another intriguing idea. This one came from the eminent folklorist Catherine Briggs.
In Scotland and in parts of Ireland, there's the belief that they were the fallen angels that followed Satan but weren't in his counsels. so that they were led away by him. You get a graphic description of this, that when Satan was thrown out of heaven by the angel, he fell, taking his immediate confederates with him, and a whole train of deceived angels followed him, and the son said to the father, "Father, heaven is emptying, lift your hand." And God lifted his hand, and everyone stopped where they were. The ones who'd followed Satan directly were down in hell. The ones who were working away towards that through the mountains were stuck in the mines and were the goblins of the mines. The ones who were going down through the sea to Satan were the sea fairies, the mermaids and the merrows and such creatures. And the ones that were in the woodlands and things stayed as the woodland elves.
The late Catherine Briggs, with the theory that fairies are sort of fallen angels. There is a belief that they were so displeased with their state of existence that they secretly envied the humans and wished that they were at least partly mortal. This led to the stories of fairies kidnapping and marrying human partners. There are also tales of them stealing beautiful babies and putting in their place either one of their own sickly children or an old withered fairy who would scream and complain all day long. So a human parent whose baby was deformed, moronic, or just plain ugly could blame it all on the fairies. This awful creature wasn't theirs. Their baby had been exchanged for a fairy child. In fact, it was a changeling. People believed that if a changeling was ill-treated, the fairies would rescue it and return the human child to its rightful parents. This was a very strongly held belief and probably caused a great deal of suffering to hundreds of innocent, if ugly, babies. But it was a useful excuse when harmed in any way. In Scotland, the gypsies still tell stories about changelings. Bessie White, a traveller from Montrose, has a tale of when her own mother and grandmother were out one day selling pegs. They paid a regular call on a woman in a remote hillside cottage. This woman usually welcomed them and gave them a few potatoes. However, on this particular day, she looked very ill, and she said that her newborn baby couldn't get any rest. Bessie tells how her grandmother looked at the baby. The baby immediately started pulling terrible faces at her and blowing raspberries. She knew then that it must be a changeling. She sent the baby's mother out of the house on a trumped-up errand, and then asked her daughter, Bessie's mother, to fetch a shovel full of horse dung. When this was done, she set about getting rid of the changeling.
My granny took this bairn and put it on top of the shovel of dung, and she held it on top of the peat fire. And she held it there, and held it there. And this bairn was screaming and kicking and howling and screaming as the shovel was getting hotter and hotter. And it screamed and kicked and screamed, but she still held it till it started cursing and swearing in Gaelic, and cursing and swearing, and cursing and swearing. And she still held it. And she held it like that, and the shovel was getting red hot, and there was a push, just like a push of smoke, went up this lump. And the shovel was empty. And this gibbet started coming down the chimney and soot and everything, and nearly blackened out the fire, and the cursing and the swearing and the noise that she heard at the top of this house. But my mother was standing back a bit, and she says, "Oh, Ma," she says, the bairn's in the cradle." And she says, "Is it?" She says, "The bairn's back in the cradle, Ma." It was a real bairn that was back in the cradle.
All the way back to their camp, Bessie's mother and grandmother could hear the changeling cursing and swearing, and to protect themselves, they drew lucky horseshoes in the dust. Apparently it's always advisable to protect yourself against a fairy, even if it's a good one, for they're all inclined to be a bit touchy. And as Catherine Briggs used to say, they're easily offended.
A good fairy is a pretty nasty person to disoblige, because the fairies are savages, well disposed when they're well disposed, but with no conscience towards punishing people as severely as they choose if their feelings are hurt or their taboos are violated.
I suppose fairies are a bit like reflections of ourselves, except that their emotions are a bit more violent. The taboos that Catherine Briggs was talking about can take a variety of forms. The fairies are secret people, and spying on them, repeating a confidence, or even thanking them can annoy them. So can disturbing their dwelling places, which is why in Ireland, even today, roads are sometimes diverted rather than have a bulldozer knock down a hawthorn tree, for that tree is special to the fairies, or as Michael O'Connor calls them, the wee people.
The wee people come out at night, they walk around, and if they come past your house and you happen to be throwing out dirty water, they don't like that at all, because dirty water on the wee people is bad for them. So they sort of, I suppose you might say, put a curse on your house. And then there's the other sort of thing where an old woman might come up at your front gate and she'll ask for a bite to eat. If you're kind to her, if you take her inside and you give her a bite to eat and a bowl of milk, she'll go away and she'll say thank you. And she'll go back to the Pishrogs, the wee people, and she'll say, that's a good house. And they'll protect that house. And there'll be prosperity for everybody that lives in that house. But if you turn the old woman away and you say, no, there's nothing for you to eat here, or there's nothing for you to drink here, she'll go away and she'll tell the Pishrogs, the wee people, and they'll put a curse on that house. And then you find the cow goes sick, or the hen goes sick, or even the child goes sick, and sometimes might die, and the doctors can't say why. But the real reason is the Pishrogs and the old woman.